we're looking at language of Rachel Jeantel, who was the chief witness for the prosecution in the case of State of Florida versus George Zimmerman, who shot Trayvon Martin in February 2012, and the trial was in summer 2013. She was of interest to us because she was the most important witness for the prosecution, was on the stand for nearly 6 hours, but spoke a very marked vernacular variety of English that, as we show in the presentation, corresponds to what's known more generally about African American Vernacular English. So she's, her parents are from the Caribbean. Her mom is from Cuba, from Haiti, sorry, and her dad is from the Dominican Republic, but she really grew up as an African American English speaker. And she speaks a very systematic, regular vernacular. But as is often the case, people look on any non-standard variety as being, when it's used, especially in a formal setting, as somehow suggesting that you're ignorant or you're stupid. So she was pilloried by the public. Crucially, in this case, she wasn't understood by the jurors, or at least one juror who talked about this, juror B37, subsequently. And they also said they didn't find her credible. And so a large part of our paper is trying to, on the one hand, show that she was speaking a systematic, regular variety of English, and to raise questions about the ways in which vernacular varieties might often be misunderstood and their speakers disbelieved, and raise this as a research question. We have done a little bit of research on the literature on this, but we hope to get other people involved, other students involved in tracking down the extent to which this happens. This is why we had a kind of alternative title for the paper called Justice for Jeantels. We never did get to come back and to talk and explain what that meant, but we meant justice for Rachel Jeantel and the other people who are like her, who may speak heavily vernacular varieties and are misunderstood or disbelieved or negatively viewed by jurors and the general public to the extent that their case isn't really properly heard. Speakers often think that varieties that are not standard or not mainstream or not the language of the powerful have no system. And we know from general theoretical assumptions and also from empirical evidence that that's nonsense. So every variety is structured, highly regular.
When you hear non-mainstream American English speech, it's attributed to not having a grammar, which means that speakers do not have a system of rules in place. But in fact, Rachel does display a system of rules and patterns that map directly onto patterns we've observed in African American English. It might not be the set of patterns that what we would call a mainstream American English speaker would follow, right? There is what we call variation, but it is still a valid system and a valid way of speaking. And so I think what we wanted to do, again, is to try and show through a linguistic analysis is that, look, she's doing these particular things in her speech that are really systematic. They're not random. For example, I want to think of one specifically from her speech, her daddy fiance house, right? Where we don't hear the possessive marker, the S. Instead of her daddy's fiance's house, she says her daddy fiance house, right? And in AAVE, you don't necessarily have to mark the possessive S in those sort of contexts. And so that would be an example of when Rachel uses an AAVE pattern in her speech.
So you can't just disregard her because she happens not to be speaking the kind of dialect you would like to hear. If you're trying to have a judicial system that's fair, you have to give her a really fair trial, either providing translation or making extra special efforts to make sure that everybody understands what she's saying. And there's some crucial points in the trial, like the one point at which she says, when she was asked by the prosecution, you know, could you hear what was being said when Trayvon was on the ground with Zimmerman? And she said, I couldn't. And it was Trayvon's. Could you hear who it was that was screaming? He said, I couldn't, it was Trayvon. And the transcript of that deposition, which is not the same as a court transcript, said, I couldn't hear Trayvon. So it's a complete opposite. She's saying, yes, I could hear. And the transcript says, no, I couldn't hear. And in fact, that turns out to be a major part of the trial because the defense attorneys were trying to show that she was lying, that they were trying to impeach her testimony. As it turns out, they weren't successful in doing that. But we think that a lot of what she said was absolutely crucial. It was the complete opposite in many cases of what Zimmerman claimed. Trayvon Martin wasn't around himself to tell his side of the story, so she was the closest proxy to Trayvon Martin. So with witnesses, you can't cherry pick them. You can't say, I like how this person speaks, I like how this person looks, and I'm going to then pick them to be my witness. You have to take what you get. And looking at the ways in which her testimony seemed to be both misunderstood and disbelieved makes us wonder about a number of African Americans and other dialect speakers whose stories, so to speak, are not either heard or believed in courts, and also in schools and workplaces and elsewhere because of these dialect differences. Other studies we've looked at more recently is a 2010 study where it turns out that if speakers believe that if they hear the speaker is accented, they're a heavily accented speaker, then whatever that speaker says is deemed less credible, or is found to be less credible than if you just get a regular American English, preferably standard English speaker. So those are very powerful effects, and you know, in cases like criminal justice system where, you know, truth, but the truth of the situation is so vital, and where it's what we're trying to find out to determine guilt or innocence, they can have a powerful effect on the outcomes of cases. And we don't think the extent of that effect is really appreciated yet. Because people think, they speak dialects of English, it's no big deal. Everybody can understand them. But we can see in this case that they didn't. We have a complicated story to tell here. On the one hand, we want to say about her language that she's a fluent, highly competent, efficient user of a variety of English that's well known. It's been in existence for many, many years, if not centuries. And she's a terrific exemplar of it. On the other hand, we want to say that based on the evidence we've seen from the testimony and based on the evidence we see from the performance of students at her school, that she's a poor reader. And we try to connect that, and that was actually used against her several times during the trial, sometimes quite effectively by the defense attorney. So we want to draw attention to that disparity and say that that's something that we find in many parts of the country. We find that very often African Americans do poorly on tests of literacy and so on. Now, we also want to emphasize that there's nothing inherent, nothing connected to being African American and working class, or connected to speaking the vernacular that makes the reading the way it is. One of the contrasts, which I'm glad you asked the question because we didn't get to make this point in the talk at all, is that your linguistic competence comes from your family and your peers. You know, you kind of inherit a system from your parents. It's shaped on the playground and so on by the kids that you interact with. And in this case, even though it's vernacular, it's fluent and it's fantastic. Your reading, for a lot of people, except a lot of middle class people who learn to read from their parents before they even go to school, you really depend on the schools. And the schools are what really let Richard, Jeantel, and many African American speakers down. And what we try to show a bit in our presentation is that while it's by no means the only way to achieve literacy, there are some techniques that linguists have developed that involve contrastive analysis and so on, that seem to succeed more with vernacular speakers than the run-of-the-mill methods that take no account of the language skills that people bring to school. And so we have some evidence that in fact you can remove or reduce this achievement gap in relation to reading if we take the language into account more than we do right now. And so we're urging that as one of the strategies for doing so.
Children, I think, really appreciate having their voice respected and their language respected in the classroom so that they can feel like they contribute something worthwhile to the discussion. And so I know, I think John mentioned earlier that the interrupting method, or saying that's wrong, you mispronounced this, is not a good strategy. And I think if you do this method of comparison by showing students, well, actually this is how, your system may do this, and this is how the mainstream American English system does this. I think by doing that comparative sort of method, that's more beneficial for the student and makes them aware in a way that just telling them they're wrong doesn't, right? Because it's like, okay, I'm wrong, but why? What's actually wrong about it? And so we're actually telling them, actually, you're not wrong. You're just going by a different system of rules. And so we're going to show you when you're going to switch to this system in this particular writing instance, and when you can switch to this one. And I think, again, I said in the talk that in the Q&A, there are plenty of methods we could use to bring AAVE into the classroom, especially in the arts. I think it's really appreciated. We see it in popular culture. You see it with hip hop artists. You see it in the church with the preacher style. You see it in acting, certain movies require for you to speak in the vernacular. It's everywhere, and it's appreciated. And I think we could still bring that same appreciation to the classroom with students by providing contexts like those in which, again, they feel valued.